Good evening. Welcome to the last of our lecture series at the School of Architecture. And I'm glad that you could all sort of pull yourselves away from the desk. I know that this is the time when you're all kind of glued in place in the studio. And I think this is an especially apt lecture to finish with. I was looking at Hilary Sample's and Michael Meredith's CVs, and they're both graduates from a certain undergraduate school in 1994. And so I was thinking about what you can actually accomplish in 16 years, and some of you actually weren't much older than that when you started here. When I look at the work of Moss, it's actually an incredible trajectory, and it's been especially dense over the last 8, 9 years. I first saw some of the work from the office in an unexpected place, and this is before I knew there was any Syracuse connection at all. So this is a quite honest kind of respect for the work. There was a very unassuming entry out of 1,500 for the Pentagon 9/11 Memorial, potentially very difficult project, hard for it not to be freighted in a way that could be kind of over-determined in its formal vocabulary. Difficult to think about what jurors made up of former Secretary of Defenses might select, and so to find a proposal which, rather than having, sort of eagles with thunderbolts in their talons, to have actually a very simple, quiet disc made of stone, seen through a pink haze of cherry blossoms, a kind of signifier for Washington, and the black, a kind of pedestal, a kind of monument that actually invited people to step on top of the polished surface and become, in some way, memorialized and become an object for others to view coming out of this pink, kind of deceptively quiet grove, all next to that architecture of the Pentagon. Kind of a remarkable sight. But the work of Moss goes quite easily between the worlds of art, architecture, what some might term industrial design. Their work has been shown at the Cooper Hewitt in the Triennial, beautiful piece which looks Baroque and is a series of hangars. They've just recently come from a group show at the Venice Biennale in the American Pavilion, and I guess most recently just from Columbus, Ohio at the Wexner Center in a collaborative project, again with an artist, Tobias Putri. Yeah, close enough for government work, thank you. And but if one ever had to think about a case, or the case to be made about the kind of missability of the boundaries between art and architecture, I think this is certainly a practice that combines writing, research, and making at a kind of fundamental level that goes from architecture, from houses, to the very small scale of hangars. Deceptively simple, very powerful, very smart. I'm pleased to say that Hilary has just also joined our board, and so this is my job as booster for the school, and I'm very, very delighted to welcome Hilary Sample to the stage. Hilary.
It's great. Can everybody hear me? Actually, I think I have the start. Okay, can everyone hear me now? Sorry about that. I had to take it off for the photo. Well, thank you for the introduction. And it's great to be back visiting Syracuse. Michael and I were here, I think it was in the spring, Mark Linder had invited us for the design and technology charrette that we worked on with Claire, which was really a lot of fun. We stayed up quite late talking to everyone, and I really enjoyed that. I think, I don't know, it seemed like the students were surprised we stayed up that late because we're so old now, but anyways. And I really would like to also thank Anda for inviting me to give a talk tonight, and it was a really seamless trip coming here, so I really enjoyed it. It's really great to be back. It's also kind of strange in some ways because everything, it looks pretty amazing, and I think the school's incredible. And also just coming to Syracuse and seeing all the new architecture is very inspiring and exciting, and I think great to be in that kind of atmosphere. So tonight's title is called In Progress, and of course when you give the title months ago, you know, you're not exactly sure where you're going to be at the time when the lecture actually comes. So some things have actually been potentially completed, and I'll talk about other things that are in fact in progress, which is maybe timely for you guys who are finishing this term, and it's a really tough time of the semester. I don't know that that ever really truly ends, but not to freak you out. So I'm sure everyone will do very well this term. I wanted to start just by reading something, and I'll just show an image of the office. This is part of our office in New Haven. It's a very small space we have, pretty intimate, but we've been working really hard on trying to create a kind of interesting sort of building architecture culture within our office, something we spend a bit of time thinking about. So I'm just going to begin by reading a statement, if you can bear with me while I do this. I think it is obvious to everyone in the room that architecture is within a transitional moment. Perhaps architecture is always within a transitional moment, always on the verge of irrelevance or in a new state of crisis, always searching for new beginnings, new relevance, or formal vitality. But there are moments that are more self-conscious than others, and this is surely one of them. As we take stock of the current state of architecture, we can see that a previously dominant sort of architectural gamesmanship concerning form has become exhausted, and that the thrills of new forms, especially in the current economic climate, have become dulled by the amount of capital necessary to produce extravagant intricacies. We can also see that the old fights of formalists against functionalists, against materialists, etc., fights that are characterized by an overly simplistic fixity and singularity of these categories are less and less relevant to working within the world at large. Within this transitional moment and all its disarray, there are some who would respond with equally totalizing and singular discourses. New fascism, or just building a better mousetrap. I'm not interested in limiting the agency of architecture to any singular discourse, even if it is something new. Rather, our stock-taking can't escape the idea that we are dealing with everything all at once, and that more so than ever before, anything and everything is both available and necessary for our use as architects. Architecture is at a moment where it is no longer monolithic, but is being developed in parallel genres. If anything, the future of architecture should be a radical new conception of the discipline, new methods of disciplinary evaluation and analysis. Otherwise, we will only experience a further fragmenting of the discipline into ever more narrow and irrelevant species and genres. Today, there are new combinations of histories and disciplines accessible to students and architects, which weren't available to prior generations. Architects can work as they always have, as generalists and alchemists, but with more ingredients and information. The tribal singularity of disciplinary and subdisciplinary categories cannot remain intact as mutually exclusive entities. This type of structure is no longer relevant. Within this new and profound promiscuity, I have been working on the problem of performance in architecture. Of course, performance as a term is loaded with allusions to people like Banham or the Smithsons, but basically the problem of performance is threefold. It deals with technology, the social, and the formal. I believe that the technological and social aspects of performance, and most of all, their many intersections, are the most promising avenues of research that can provide new narratives for the production of architecture and the production of architectural discourse. These narratives are ultimately incompatible with the false positivisms of functionalism and formalism. Performance is inherently a cultural project as opposed to a scientific one. I will try to situate this a little further. Since 2003, after graduating from Princeton grad school, I have been part of a practice generation of architects, post-Shop, post-Herzog and de Meuron, post a previous generation of architects engaged in the real. The real for Shop is economics. The real for Herzog and de Meuron is material visceralities. These things are important to us too, of course, but at the same time, we are not interested in giving up on the representational world of architecture, the representational project, and the representation of narrative. I believe that an important part of the future of architecture will be rethinking of representation, the development of new narratives, and the creation of new relationships between production, reception, and analysis. We need to find new ways of engaging the world, through buildings, of course, but also through representation. Formal narratives are not enough. As part of a broader attempt to renew and participate in a viable architectural experimentation, my practice, Moss, plays within multiple current discourses simultaneously and seeks out new methodologies that can collapse the real and the representational, art and life, so to speak. I am especially interested in time-based media, narrative, video, and real-time simulation software, and the role these modes of representation can play in architecture as both methods of production and ways to engage new and diverse constituencies. The same way that experimental painting practices were later extended and reworked in video art, through my work at Moss, we have been engaged with the architectural experimentation of the previous generation and a reworking of these practices in time-based media. Moss produces software with real-time physics and real-time structural form finding, movies of real projects, and objects with overlapping fictional narratives that conflate the art-life regimes of formalists and functionalists into an uncomfortable and awkward mixture, and drawings that evoke a historical paradigm with contemporary digital processes. The goal of this work is perhaps to rethink and revive the experimentation practice in architecture, and to do so while not giving up on the practice of the real. So, with that, I'll go through some of the projects that we've been working on. So one of the first projects that we've been doing, and I think one of the things we've found recently is that, that we've been working on projects that have been built that have a real kind of permanence. And lately, a lot of the other work we've been doing has become more and more temporary. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about and trying to understand a little bit more about the idea of temporary and what that means. This is one of the first projects that we built. It's a house in upstate New York, well, very much upstate, just south of Rochester by 1 hour on one of the Finger Lakes in Honeo Lake. So the client was a young couple with young children, and they were living in Rochester, but wanted to have a kind of weekend, year-round weekend house. And so the site is a very steep slope. You actually come to the site from a driveway up above. So the very first thing you see is the roof, which is not a typical experience, right? You don't usually come to architecture or a building and look down on the roof. So this was something we had to think very carefully about, what that meant and how to arrive at the house. Also the idea that it had this incredible, which you can start to see to the side, lake. It's not working. Anyway, lake over here. To think about this idea of how you begin to not give that away all the time. And this is something we're really interested in, and we've worked on in some other projects that I'll show in a minute. So we started to think a lot about this idea of descending down into the site and how the house could actually begin to formally, in terms of its shape, begin to mimic and reflect that. So in fact, the kind of slope of the roof of the house, which to us was really kind of the most important part, began to reflect the site conditions. But also we were very interested in the idea of vernacular type and the kind of agricultural vernacular buildings that we saw driving into the site, and also something that Michael and I both very much appreciate in growing up. I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania around sort of Bethlehem Steel, so the kind of industrial and post-industrial landscape is very interesting to me. And similarly, Michael grew up near Saratoga and Albany, and the kind of from GE to also kind of farm buildings is something that we've been very interested in our practice, is the idea of type. And so we started to look at this idea of how the house could actually start to draw upon those things. The idea that it's all white would sort of tap into these sort of all white barns or agricultural buildings, combined with a new thinking about the roof and the interior. The plan being very dense in the middle, we wanted to eliminate this kind of, let's say, more Victorian idea of a house where the center is always very solid and heavy. So we opened it up with a kind of central, two sort of shafts that in a way compete for light and air, that you could actually open it up. You could see snow coming down in the middle of winter, in a way to also, let's say, not give away the lake view, and that you're not always sort of looking at the lake. So the next project we got, which is a story I kind of always like to tell, and it's that we got a phone call. At this point, we were both living in Toronto and we're teaching, and someone called and asked us if we would be interested in working on a lake house, and had we ever done one. And we said, sure. The thing that was so strange about it is that the client had recently bought this island, this kind of granite island. This is about 3 hours north of Toronto in what's called Muskoka. And there are many, many islands, and it's very much a kind of family retreat. A lot of it you just cannot access in the wintertime. So it's a very kind of brutal environment. As you can see, some of the trees are completely bent from the winds. And so the client at that time called and said, you know, our neighbor on the other island just finished a cottage, and they told us the architect's name, but we couldn't remember. All we have are initials, and we knew that, you know, this person taught in Toronto. And so it was a completely wrong number, in a way. And, you know, we had just finished the Hill House, and so we said, yes, of course, you know, Lake House is no problem. We began talking to them, and the client, he's in advertising, and she raises 2 children, but is also an incredible photographer. So we immediately began talking about how we could work together and spend a lot of time driving up. When they told us they had an island, we didn't quite know what to expect. You know, that we're not, at that time, we're not really familiar with the terrain and how really truly incredible it is, and very different than anything I had ever seen growing up. And so the idea of an island to us meant something completely different than the actual reality of it, which wound up having an interior. I think you tend not to think of an island as having an interior, but in fact, it's about 3 acres, the site, and had already three buildings, an existing main house, an existing boathouse, and a small, very dilapidated kind of shed building that they wanted to convert into a sleeping cottage. So in what's in a way become a kind of practice for us is that we start off very small with all of our clients. I think perhaps this is one good strategy as a way to begin an office. You don't know how to start an office. You don't really learn this in school. That's probably a good thing. But nonetheless, we didn't really know how to begin an office. And so you sort of just start. And we've always kind of had a practice where we sat around a long table, that sort of first image I showed, and we just sort of made things for ourselves. So at this time, to actually have a real client, again, after the Hill House, was very exciting for us. And I think in the beginning, and we're probably still very much like this, we're very happy to have work and just try to do as much as we can. You feel like you maybe never get a chance again or something like this. So anyway, it was maybe a little too honest of a lecture, but in any case, so the first project was a small sleeping cottage and that we designed. And we were working with contractors who typically build kind of log cabin, a very kind of standard, economical, and traditional kind of construction. And so we didn't quite know what to expect. And so we began to look at the idea of how the island could work with these additional structures. So the idea was to do the sleeping cottage, in the future rebuild the boathouse, which was collapsing, leaning more than 45 degrees. It was completely dangerous. All the cribbage was failing because of the ice and the current underneath the ice. So the idea was to actually try to create a connection across the two ends of the island. So we came up with this idea of a necklace, and within this kind of new landscape, these sort of pavilions that sat within that, or small sort of cottages. So here you can see the sleeping cottage and then the boathouse. So one of the demands for the project also was because the weather is so harsh, and that also it's not accessible except by a kind of snowmobile. There is a kind of risk of vandalism in the winter and things like this. So we had to do things like close down, create these sort of sliding barn doors. But we took this as an opportunity to actually design things that we wouldn't have potentially been able to do otherwise, like the door handles, and experiment with, at the time, very new technologies that were accessible to us and things we were working on with our students. We actually built some of this ourselves, even from the kind of panels. We made a bathtub and a sink and brought all these things up, had them boated out to the site. But just the idea of, again, maybe going back to the Hill House and playing games with what you actually see versus what becomes more intimate and up close, and not always giving away the kind of fantastic view from around. So the next project, that went pretty well with the client. I think they really liked the space and asked us if we would work on the boathouse. So we were pretty excited to do this. It was definitely a new scale for us, bigger project. And I think at the time we were at that moment transitioning from Toronto back to the US. So all of a sudden it became another kind of layer of difficulty, let's say. None of our projects seem to ever be nearby. They're always quite distant. And so we wound up being in, sort of New England. The client lives in Ohio, and the site is still 3 hours north of Toronto, so it's quite a lot. So we had to think really about how we were going to build this, being remote and trying to achieve everything. So idea was, because the site was grandfathered, because there was already an existing boathouse, we could then build this new structure, which contained kind of bedroom, living. And one of the things that was important to us also was to try to have this kind of connection to the landscape, but not always revealing that. So there were a lot of challenges with the project. One is that the client, for economic reasons, wanted to start construction after the typical building season, which meant fall and winter. So it seems kind of crazy to begin a project on water in the winter, but that's what we did. And we also took advantage of all the industry surrounding this region of the Georgian Bay. And so essentially everything was built within an 80-kilometer distance, including the steel floating pontoons and the house itself. One of the things we found out during the project was that the contractors never looked at the drawings. And as they started construction, they would send us images through Flickr, through email. So we basically did this project entirely through Flickr, and just looking at them, writing emails back to them saying, that's not right, can you fix this, take another photo. And then we eventually 3D printed this model, which was quite large, and we took it to the site, and they basically built the house from the model. The model got destroyed in the end, and it's completely lost. So needless to say, we were pretty nervous. We didn't anticipate building a project through a printed model, let alone through Flickr. And no one really believed us either when we were saying that's how we were doing it. So it seemed really tough at the time. And then one day we got this photo where we were building the moment frames on the end with the kind of wood framing. You can see the pontoons here. And then we noticed this little hut, and it was their warming hut that they would sort of warm themselves up in. And we were pretty happy with this because they said that they built it in the shape of the house because they like the house. So we were pretty excited about that. Kinds of moments where we felt pretty good about that. These are just some drawings. I think some of the ideas of representation we've been working on, kind of exploded axons are something we drew many times while at Syracuse for sure, and drawings we love to make. But we looked at the idea of really how the facade in itself as a wrapper, and because of the conditions of the site, there's no air conditioning in the summer. It really needs to breathe, so it acts as a rain screen, and the perforations allow for light and air to filter through. And the way that the house then actually meets the land is by a bridge. And one of the ideas was that through this idea of the kind of necklace or the sort of loop of the island, if you're visiting, you can actually sort of just bypass, you don't have to go inside, so there could be some privacy inside and down this kind of internal stair across the dock and keep going. So the next project for us, as we were working on the floating house, we were introduced to an artist who was working in upstate New York, worked in New York City, but then also recently bought property in upstate New York, and was thinking about shifting his practice from Manhattan to upstate, not permanently, but as a kind of expansion and a new way to find additional space and perhaps change his work. So similarly to the previous project, we were asked if we could work on something small, and we said, of course, sure, sounds great. And so we started to look at this idea of a shed. What they asked us for was a shed to hold wood for their fireplace. And we started to think about the idea of structural surfaces, and we began to look at ways in which we could use a very cheap, lightweight system that we could fabricate ourselves. Again, most of our projects, the budgets are very small, and we have to think about how we can achieve certain things within that. So that's a certain kind of discipline that we've tried really hard to work with. So essentially we started looking at this site, which is very different than either of the two projects we had before in some ways, very dense with trees. And we very much like this idea of the kind of light and darkness with which the sort of atmosphere occurs around what's an existing house, and a very kind of standard, normal sort of house for this particular area. You can start to see the wood shed back in the back here, or the wood for the shed. So we started thinking about the perforation that was needed, not only as a kind of aesthetic project, but also for performance, that the wood has to have always air in order for it to be usable. And so this idea of a kind of perforated aluminum panel was something that could be used and constructed pretty easily. So we have had a long-standing relationship with a fabricator in Vermont who has a water jet cutter. So we water jet cut this, brought it to the site, and constructed it ourselves in a weekend. One of the things about the quality of the shed and the material of the aluminum is that it changes with the climate. So in this case, in snow, it becomes much brighter. In summer, it picks up on the kind of warmth. So from that, it led to a kind of relationship with the artist and his wife, who's a curator, to talk more carefully about their ideas for their property and a bigger project, which is the artist studio. One of the things that was very interesting to us and also curious and exciting was that already the artist had a collection of metal buildings. He had a Quonset hut, an Airstream trailer. So there was this discussion and conversation around the idea of metal and what that could be. And so not only thinking about, let's say, structural surfaces, but also how an additional studio building on the property would respond to that material interest. So since the painter, the artist worked in New York in a kind of loft building, he owned a building with several floors, each floor kind of dedicated to something different, one level being painting, one being drawing, one being a kind of archive collection of images and storage. All of these things needed to be considered in this new space in upstate. So we began to think about how can you replicate this idea of the loft and take advantage then of new lighting strategies so that you wouldn't really need artificial light. to light the space. And one of the things that we thought a lot about was this incredible open space that you could have in the plan. And so in the beginning, the kind of front is for painting, a sort of storage box, and the back is drawing. So we were really interested in this idea of, again, this kind of structurally stable surfaces. And we worked, in the computer, obviously. But one of the things we found, and this is maybe perhaps one of the moments of really starting to look at the idea of software development in the office, was that we had a budget for the project, but it wasn't enough to afford an engineer in the beginning. And we also, in all of our projects, they're always very fast. So we don't really have time, and we worry a lot about, of course, is it going to stand up? Most basic fundamental problems of architecture, right? And so we started to look at ways in which we could try to do this ourselves and start writing our own software and trying to experiment with how, in fact, you can model something that it will work and give you the properties you want. And so similarly to the floating house, where we had all of the structure at the ends as a moment frame, we started to look at this condition again here. So the kind of pink are the actual steel moment frames. And what that allowed us to do is a kind of three-legged structure, like a three-legged table, is actually very structurally stable. And that allowed us to then make these kind of exterior porches to sort of sit on and sit outside and relax. And then it allowed us to make an interior space that was completely open. So there's actually no structure here supporting the roof. And that allowed us to create this kind of sort of plane that you could work underneath. And this is with all of the lights on. Mostly the artist doesn't work with the lights on, but it does allow for, obviously, a kind of nighttime thing. One of the things that was interesting about the project, and that was part of the challenge, was that now the artist was able to change the sort of size of the paintings and also lay them out sort of next to each other in series, which is often how he worked. So for us, that was a pretty incredible moment to be able to see that. The kind of diagram section showing this. All of the trusses then in the end were all wood, CNC'd, so they could all be unique, and that's how we were able to get the shape. Similarly to the other projects, the landscape being the kind of dense trees, but also these pretty amazing shale walls around the site were something we wanted to play games with also, of looking at closely. Because the form of the project is a parallelogram, the way in which you actually move around the building, it's always kinds of changes the shape of it and the way you experience the sort of lengths of it. We talked a lot about what this would look like from the exterior, the idea that we did studies that showed different kind of patterning all seemed to become too much. One of the things we thought a lot about was, as someone coming here and working on a daily basis is very different than, let's say, a public building. And so we kept the idea for the kind of shingle to be a kind of parallelogram, sort of mimicking the plan, but keeping it a rather straightforward patterning of the building. The material is zinc, which has a 200-year lifespan. We wanted this project to be low maintenance, and so we looked at options for that. So while we were working on that project, we were asked to do an art historian's library and studio space in New Jersey. So a kind of reworking of an old barn that had been converted into a garage. These still look that way as garage doors. You can tell the kind of reminiscent shape of that. So we basically replaced all of the windows and built a kind of insertion, trying to be careful not to rework anything else around it. Again, another project where the budget was extremely low. So we essentially made a kind of insertion for the book collection, which are these pink bars. And the other part of the problem here, and similarly to the other projects, is that there was no sort of heating or cooling, being an old structure. So we had to insert all of these things in a really cheap way. And so we were able to think about how to tap into the existing barn structure, which was essentially an open space between the second floor and the wall of the building, which you would drop hay from. So we filled this in with a kind of perforated pattern in combination with things like ceiling fans, and then ducts that were woven in between the wood beams, wood joists. So this creates a total system of pulling air up and pushing air down. And these things we made by hand. We installed ourselves. We didn't make them by hand. They were routed on the computer, but we spent an awful lot of time on site doing a lot of the work ourselves. Next project we were invited to do was a house, part of Ordos 100, 100 young offices working on a compound project in Ordos in Inner Mongolia. And we were interested here in looking at some of the ideas that we've worked on sort of all along in the office, looking at ideas of type, looking at ideas of roof structure, how we could begin to respond to a brief that was frankly very strange. We were told there's no client, and I think most of the architects working on this project really grappled with that as a problem. And there was not a whole lot of information given. You didn't really understand the site. And we did get to go several times, but it was just desert. So it was very hard to, and you were told that the desert's going to be moved, which is an incredible feat in itself. But how do you begin to design something that you really don't know very much about? And you're told not to worry about that, not to worry about a client, and so forth. And so we began by thinking about the idea of the Chinese garden and the typical Chinese courtyard house. And so the program that was given was something like 10,000 square feet, something really large. And something, when we did the design and technology studio in the spring, we looked at the idea of a very small house or subdividing these kind of large scale houses, so maybe antithetical to what we were just teaching, but nonetheless, trying to look at the program that was given, and everything that was given was large and small. So there was always a large bedroom, a small bedroom, large dining, small dining, swimming pool, completely large scale house. And we began to think about these pieces as being more discrete parts, connected on their corners, trying to eliminate the idea of the corridor in a house, and so that you actually move through the kind of corners. We were interested in how you could start to play games with the idea of the roof and ideas of light and air moving through. I'm just going to break for a minute and show some of the films. So these are some of the as part of working on the project and not quite understanding the not, let's say, having to respond to other issues that a project typically requires, we began to really play more in the office, which is something that we've worked really hard at doing, is always trying to find moments where we can play and experiment, and it's not always the best economical thing for a project, but we try to do this all the time. So here, trying to think about more the form and the relationship between the forms and ideas of light and air eventually. This is sort of it's kind of one track of the project that we worked on while building models and doing drawings. We've actually completed the construction documents and signed them. The sort of China Institute that is responsible for developing the project, they completed taking our drawings and putting them into a format, sent them back to us, and we've reviewed them. So it all seems like potentially it's going forward. It's really hard to know for sure what happens. So you get the idea. The other part, or to say that another part of the project that we started to experiment with was actually making a film. which we made for the Venice Biennale in 2008. Sorry, full screen. So this is a film we made about fictitious characters that actually live in the house. Again, since we had no client and we were told to ignore anybody who would actually live there, not even think about it, we had a really hard time dealing with that. And so we invented X and Y, and we made a film about their life in the house. So for us, part of the interest in trying these things out is that, sort of, unlike painting, architecture does not have a specific medium in which we work. And so we're very interested in trying out different things and always sort of experimenting. So when in the beginning, I mentioned that there are these kind of built projects and sort of more real projects, and then the office has invested an awful lot of time in temporary work. And this is probably one of the first projects. We were invited to submit a proposal for PS1 in 2007. And so we made a proposal for a temporary pavilion that was an inflatable, working with the geometry of the site, learning about the site, which is in Long Island City. It's an old school building, hence the PS1, for those of you maybe not familiar with the site. And the site that we had to occupy, actually the old playgrounds, which were always in the sun from morning till night, really intense heat, pretty brutal site condition, a 16-foot high concrete wall. And the idea is that you're to make an urban beach. And so we proposed probably something not really urban beach-like at all, in fact, but rather a kind of canopy for shade, seating that were essentially planters that we planted moss and other sort of cool landscaping. And we worked with an inflatable manufacturer in Canada, someone we didn't know before, but through our research, and we do a lot of research in the office, found someone who would be interested to work with us. And so we worked with an idea of a new kind of inflatable fabric, which was actually a three-dimensional fabric, two sort of planes held together by fibers that was super strong. You can see someone sort of standing on it. And that the project was actually made through individual cells that would be then seamed together using a new technology of seaming, which allowed us to have openings, and so you could have hot air kind of rise through. Well, we didn't win that project then, but it led to a much bigger project and a project for an actual inflatable factory. So the client is an inflatable manufacturer, and he asked us, and really enjoyed the process of working with us, and asked us if we would want to design an actual inflatable factory for him. So we were pretty excited about this opportunity, and we started to look at, again, ideas, let's say, structural surfaces, and the idea of the roof. So here we were looking at new ways to actually build the structure, which is one of the probably the best part of the project, is that the client has an in-house engineering staff, and so we've been able to work with an inflatable engineering expert who has worked on this, pretty much his whole life, and so that's been one of the most amazing things about the project. And so we went through a series of structural tests, really trying to try out new systems to sort of rethink the idea and the image of the inflatable. I think generally everyone kind of thinks of things like, sort of white, opaque structures. This is different than the dome, and we actually built a mock-up, finding out the way it would actually work. Different problems between fabric strength and weld strength. Typically, welds fail. We had some problems with the fabric failing. The welds were too strong, but the kind of scale of the the kind of scale of the structure, you can see that just a kind of general warehouse winds up being too small. And most of his inflatables that he manufactures has to be inflated in a local high school. This is in a very small town in Newfoundland called Grand Bank. It's something like 3,000 people. And mostly everyone works in the inflatable factory or in the fishing industry. So it's a pretty, totally weird project in some ways for us. And we started to look at ideas of how you could begin to get light in by actually separating the structure, connecting it together through straps, kind of site plan. We make a lot of models in the office. We built this summer in the office, and starting to look at also the exterior, that we could have a kind of translucent skin. So one of the things that has been fantastic in a way for this project is that we've been able to really experiment not only with structure, but also the idea of enclosure. Another project where we began to really look at ideas of form finding, which we do through model making, but also through then the computer and kind of processing and writing our own software, was another temporary project that never happened for Covent Garden in the UK, which we called Arcade. We also made a film about this. I'm not showing that tonight. But there's just this idea of kind of looking at catenary structures and hanging systems and testing real-time physics led to then a proposal for the second time we were invited to do PS1, which was built then in 2009 called After Party, where we began to link the courtyard spaces through a series of these individual cell structures that were made up of spokes, oculi, and arches. One of the things we had to think about was the idea of it being for so many people, the idea that it's this kind of massive party, which is a little hard to think about when you're not really a party person or party animal, let's say. We prefer to maybe sit on the benches than that, so we had to think a little bit about how we were going to accommodate 6,000 people, and one of the things was to make a kind of larger space that would allow people to move through and come to the sort of stage or enter the museum, and then another space that was more about a kind of intimate experience and just sort of relaxing, and so some of the drawings. We also wanted to think about ideas of how this could also similarly, let's say to the previous version, think about shade, and one of the things also was how you could really build this very economically. So we were the first group to think about this project after, let's say, the fall of the economy. And so budgets were very tight. There was really no funding for donations, which is largely how this project gets made, in addition to all of the volunteers and students. We were very happy to have several Syracuse students help us with the project, which was great. We wouldn't have finished without everyone, for sure. And so, that we had to actually present ways in which we could make this work. There were so many restrictions on the project. You can't touch the concrete walls. Anything you put in the ground has to come out. So we invented this kind of 3-foot, 30 inches deep steel footer, which weighed just over 100 pounds, could be lifted out by 2 people, and inserted those. It was covered with aluminate fabric for the interior, which is used in greenhouses to reflect light for hydroponic farming. And then the outside was covered in thatch, which came from Indonesia. And we worked with farmers there. A former student of ours had gone back to Indonesia, and we worked with him. They were one of the only makers that were comfortable with letting the thatch actually be really long. Typically these are woven more like sisal rugs, and they're used in roofing. No one really was interested or had the capability to let the thatch just be super hairy. So we really worked for quite a while on that, and they came by boat. It was a long process for sure. On top of that, it rained almost 30 consecutive days. So the whole idea that we were going to make something to shade, we had no idea if it worked until the kind of opening. This is like one brief moment, but the weather was pretty awful during the construction. Pretty nerve-wracking with people on scaffold. But here it is at the opening. We also were interested in the idea of a kind of local vernacular and the kind of smokestacks, and talking about, or trying to have the kind of dialogue with the urban context, and that this wasn't just about something you discover on the inside, but that you could also see outside, so you could see it from the subway train that comes by. And similarly, this idea of the temporary project, something we kind of struggle with in a way. I think maybe as architects you want your work to stay permanently. I'm not sure really about that, but I guess when you're starting, and because we've started with houses, it seems very strange to work on projects that don't last. So we've, again, started to think about other ways in which we could use media, and we made a film of PS1, so it sort of will live on, but in a different life. This is, I'm just going to go quickly through some projects now, because I think we're getting to the end, but this is a project we've been working on for a few years. It's a drive-in theater The idea here, looking at type in combination as a drive-in screen with a band shell. So the project is for Ballroom Marfa, and it would be in combination with MoMA's film department, and there was a kind of beginning discussion about silent films being shown and then live bands playing. And so we're very interested in this idea of combination of things, the idea of films and music as a very big part of our interests in the office. And so trying to look at, again, a sort of idea of structural surface and modeling. We actually built a mock-up of the project, and then the project is on hold, but we're hopeful it will still go forward. Next series of projects we've been working on with Tobias Putri, a Slovenian artist who's now based in Boston, who began inviting us to collaborate with him. This is an installation at the Baltic Gallery now 2 years ago in the UK, where we started looking at the idea of stacked blocks. So from kind of catenary structures to stacked blocks to nets, we've been exploring all these different sort of structural types through the software. And I'll just break quickly. So this is some of the software we've been writing and experimenting, and the idea was that we would actually build up the structure until it gets to the point of collapse. And what we found was that in the museum space, the curators were very anxious about actually building anything that wouldn't stay stacked up. So we had to use glue in the end. But what we found, and we built this in kind of several places in different configurations, but really testing it until it actually collapses. And some of the things that we found as a result are the forms that, this sort of ad hoc, unpredictable forms that result like heaps. So when the blocks all wind up in a kind of heap, we actually found that in itself to have a kind of interesting structural property, and we've looked at that in other projects I'll show in a few minutes. But so essentially writing the software and that you can type in a kind of wind or apply, it has real gravity, it has real-time physics, and that we can look at that. Okay, so the idea of sort of moss stack going to moss heap. This is another version that we built at the Boymans Gallery in Rotterdam to MIT List Gallery. And here in this time we looked more carefully at the idea of drawing, kind of exploded the sort of Choisy. These were drawings, and Choisy was someone I looked at quite a lot in undergrad education here. This is a proposal for a community center in Uganda, a local town that has already a kind of dance troupe and real interest in community and arts despite the kind of war that's been going on. And so we've been looking at a proposal for how to build this out of stacked blocks, handmade, with a kind of sort of six blocks. So a completely different project. We were approached by Vice, a magazine. They were beginning a new project with Intel called the Creators Project, and it would be a one-day event in New York, and then it would travel to other cities around the world of a kind of exhibition, gallery, showing, talks, lectures, music, film, all the things that we're totally saturated with and really interested in. And they asked us if we could make a proposal for another temporary structure. So we started off with the idea of a kind of net and how that could work in the space, looking at a space in London and also in New York. They didn't love it, let's say, and so asked us if we could rethink the problem. So we started looking again at the idea of blocks and heaps from the stack. So in a way, this idea of failure for us is not always an end, and how we can begin to use that as a way to start something new. So we started looking at these ideas of stacking this time, projection, and this becomes the final piece. And we worked with a kind of video artist, someone who had done a lot of the stage sets and shows for the Beastie Boys. So it's pretty cool, getting to use new technologies and starting to think about projections and how this could change. And so instead of the sort of pure white blocks that we had been working with, trying to look at new ways. This didn't lead to this next project, but from that we had already been working on another type of software which we were calling sphere packing. And we were invited by the curators for a proposal for the Venice Biennale, the High Museum, and 306090 to come up with the installation for the courtyard space of the American Pavilion. So in a way, not unlike some of the other temporary projects, things like you can't touch the ground, you can't touch the walls, you can't go beyond this line in the, this sort of edge. And things like this, and there's sort of no budget to go see the site, and a very low budget, and essentially 5 weeks from the time you're awarded the project till it has to be on the boat to Italy. So it's a very fast schedule, and the challenges of actually making something. So in a way, the idea of how we could begin to use some of the things we had started with the sphere packing to actually pack the space, create a canopy, and then some of the furniture pieces we've been working on for a while, this kind of folded benches, as a place to really sit and sort of hang out, not dissimilar to some of the ideas we had from PS1. So like most of our projects, we try to make mock-ups. These are all of the straps. Some of this is also from ideas from the inflatable, how we could use nylon straps and sort of test the strength. This was, there was actually a fourth balloon that got away, which was not very fun when I had to call the FAA and tell them that there was a silver balloon flying. And so some of the benches. So the last project I'll end with is the Element House, and this is a proposal for a guest house for Star Axis, which is a land art project by Charles Ross, an artist who's been working in the site since the 70s, mid-70s. It's almost complete, but it's roughly a 10-story, it's small, if you can see in the photo here, but 10-story, all granite and concrete platform viewing machine for the stars. And so we were invited by a small, really interesting museum in Denver to design a house. They were interested in coming up with a kind of prototype for a house that could be, think about ideas of being small, being prefabricated, and could potentially go in many different sites. One of the challenges is that they didn't actually have a site in the beginning. So this idea of it being a guest house at Star Axis is something fairly new. But that led us to trying to think about some of the things we've been working on already, the idea of a kind of roof, but also chimney, that the chimney in this case, where we've seen it in PS1 or perhaps Ordos, here starts to act in a different way. And that the foundation is something that, because we were unsure where it might go, we tried to invent a new type of foundation, which seems kind of crazy because you usually want to know what your foundation is going to be. But looking at the forms and the kind of aggregation of these things together as small parts. We've also made film. This is a photo inside of the office where we set up a kind of Lazy Susan, which we bought at IKEA, which is nearby. And we also made a book from this. The project is, we're hoping to start construction in the spring. We worked with Linked by Air, and we wrote some essays, did some interviews with people, tried to show the project not just in a kind of conventional medium. And so this is the actual size of one of the chimneys.
Would you take questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Let's get the lights.
We don't need the lights.
So, let's ask some questions.
Sure.
it's actually great to see the trajectory of the work.
Mm.
You use and the way that plays out, making permanent pieces and temporary work.
Mm. It's a hard question.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I have all those answers really. I mean, a lot of it for us really is just playing and experimenting, and I think the software has come after some of the more permanent things. So, but as a way to try and I mean, even though it's temporary, it's permanent for a short while. So let's say the software informs the thing we make, and maybe we're not ready to let go of it, so we make a film of it. I mean, I don't know, it doesn't always flow that way, let's say. So. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the things though is that it's never done linearly, right? All of these things are in parallel. So for us, that we try these things out and try to find ways to represent things and look at the idea of representation through these different medium, because we feel we don't have to subscribe to one method of doing that. I don't know that, let's say, the films yet inform the work. I mean, I think it all does in some ways, but it's not so prescriptive yet for us. So it's probably still ambiguous, not answering your question, but. Right.
Where that's coming from as
Well, I think for us, I mean, we are interested very much in the idea of a structural surface. So some of these projects have much more structure in them than others in the surface. The idea of the thatch isn't really, it's quite heavy. So it helps to weigh down the weight of the structure. Since we couldn't have really traditional and permanent foundations, let's say, the foundations had to be quite light, so we needed to find something that was going to actually weigh the structure down more. So those are sort of things that we're always kind of looking at. I think for us, maybe it goes back a little bit to the idea of the vernacular building types. These sort of, they've always been a kind of monolithic structure, and that's something we're definitely interested in. Maybe we try to break that a little bit with ideas of like the stack block projects, even though, well, they're still monolithic, I guess, in their color, let's say, but I think we are interested in sort of projects that have sort of bigger open spaces and simple, more straightforward exterior representation.
between the vernacular and then
I mean, I think we're definitely interested in trying to, just trying out different methods of working even, and experimentation, structure has been a big part of the work, that it can be playful. And let's say in someone like the artist studio, we worked very closely with a manufacturer to actually make those shingles. And we made large-scale mock-ups and things like this. So, yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure yet. I think those things have been kind of distinct. Although, I mean, I think the inflatable factory as the idea of a roof form or sort of shed, I mean, I think that there are things there, but in that project we're trying to maybe break a little bit from the past or what's expected, only because we have the opportunity in a way to really test that out that we haven't had on other projects maybe. Thank you.